independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 5. She hoped I should be a good child. Hello, husband.
Hello, Miss Miller's bedfellow.
All right. I don't know how to feel about that.
I looked right through that whole chapter. I read it a couple of times. And I think the only other real term to describe Jane was like good child, which I think is the title of this episode. So
yes. Okay. So Miss Miller's bedfellow it is.
I think she says something along the lines of her first night at Lowood. She says, I would be Miss Miller's bedfellow that night.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So since there's a lot of things happening in this episode, I thought let's just get right into the summary of Chapter 5. Again, from Spark Notes. 4 days after meeting Mr. Brocklehurst, Jane boards the 6 a.m. coach and travels alone to Lowood. When she arrives at the school, the day is dark and rainy, and she is led through a grim building that will be her new home. The following day, Jane is introduced to her classmates and learns the daily routine, which keeps the girls occupied from before dawn until dinner. Miss Temple, the superintendent of the school, is very kind, while one of Jane's teachers, Miss Scatcherd, is unpleasant, particularly in her harsh treatment of a young student named Helen Burns. Jane and Helen befriend one another, and Jane learns from Helen that Lowood is a charity school maintained for female orphans, which means that the Reeds have paid nothing to put her there. She also learns that Mr. Brocklehurst oversees every aspect of its operation. Even Miss Temple must answer to him. So the first thing that comes to mind when I started this chapter is that Jane is leaving Gateshead, and she is taking a coach ride to Lowood, which begins the next stage of her life's journey. And that reminded me of the National Theatre's adaptation. It was a production of Jane Eyre, where they showed the changing of scenes many times with Jane sort of running in place as if she is taking this coach ride. And I think that just it comes to mind because he used to do sort of a funny little interpretation of that running in place.
Well, yeah, because they would do like it was a group. It wasn't just Jane running in place. It would be like a whole group as if there were other passengers, and then the whole cast would shout in unison the names of the towns that they were stopping in. You know, Derbyshire, top, 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 Lancashire, top, 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 top. You know, and then all of a sudden they'd be like, "We've arrived at Lowood." You know,
yeah, so, it's a very theatrical interpretation,
for sure.
I think it's funny to think of Jane now doing this tapping to a new city.
If you watch it's on. I don't know if it's still on YouTube. People can rent it or not.
I don't know if it's still on YouTube, but yeah.
I recommend it. It was a very good production, very minimal, and like I said, it was very clever how to do that, because if you're going to show she's traveling, how do you do it on a stage? Rather than just show up at Lowood, I like that. You know, it kind of puts you in the place, put you in the countryside, and actually, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this chapter is that it kind of you get Jane's first feeling of adventure. You know, and I have, like I said, I'm gonna spout a lot of quotes off. This is a great chapter. I really like this chapter a lot.
Love to hear it.
And my meaningful quote, I'll obviously save for the end, but there's a lot of great quotes in this chapter. And I think one of them, when Jane gets on her coach ride to Lowood, you know, she said, "Thus was I severed from Bessie and Gateshead, thus whirled away to unknown, and as I then deemed remote and mysterious regions." And so I kind of like that. Like in a way, I wish the coach trip would have been a little bit longer. Like she's kind of describing, there's a word I was going to use a lot. I hope I don't use it too much, which is vivid. Charlotte Bronte does a really good use of vivid description in this chapter when describing the school, the people at the school, and also this trip. And so she's talking about how they stop in the one town, and then oh, we got to leave again. And then all of a sudden she arrives at Lowood. I'm like, oh no, I was really getting a feel for what the English countryside would have been like in the mid 19th century, because we went up to Haworth on our anniversary or on our honeymoon, and it's very pastoral and it's a little bit spread out. But you still see a little bit of civilization. So I can only imagine what it must have looked like back then, where it would just been so tranquil, going from town to town and stuff. So I wish we could have had a little bit longer of a journey, because we're going to be at Lowood for several chapters. So it's like, let's get a little bit of a sense of how long it took to get there, you know?
I also think that I think it's mentioned a couple of times of how young Jane is to be on this coach journey all by herself. That must be really make such an impression on her to be seeing these things for the first time by herself, with strangers, and it seems a little scary for her.
Yeah, I always think about when was the first time you ever traveled alone or flew alone? Before 9/11, I remember the parents could bring the kid to the gate, put the kid on the plane, and usually the if it was another parent or a grandparent was meeting them, they could right there in the terminal with them.
That's true. I think the only time I went by myself, the first time I went by myself, was going to college, and that was also scary for me. So poor Jane, she's 10 years old.
Yeah, it's funny to think about that. Yeah, I never would have went anywhere until college. Yeah. First time my parents ever let me drive to a long distance by myself would have been when I was making college visits and stuff. I do remember years ago there was a time when I was flying, and I had a layover in Salt Lake City. And there was a kid sitting next to me that he probably was about, 10, 11, 12. And there was a delay. We had a mechanical problem. And he was just like, could I borrow your phone so that he could tell? Because the person who was waiting to pick him up, he had to be able to call them and say, hey, I'm going to be late.
Wow, that's
because he didn't have a cell phone. He was so small. He's so young, But and then I got to see him. I kind of saw him off the plane. I kind of walked him through a little bit when we arrived to make sure. But
the flight attendants are supposed to keep an eye on him or something. That's so weird.
Yeah, because I think they used to have... Don't they still have a boarding group like that now?
I don't know. Do they?
Like a pre-boarding group that's like, small children traveling alone or whatever, they get to board before the rest of the...
Oh, I don't know.
I thought. You kind of ignore it. We're so used to just getting in our groups or whatever.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't know, but...
Well, so now, Jane's left Gateshead. We're done with the reads. We're going to go to this new environment.
Are we done with the reads, though? More foreshadowing from Charlotte? Or no?
For now, we're done with the reads for now. We don't have to worry about them and how they abuse poor Jane. For now, Jane is in this completely new environment with going to school. And like you said, it's described very well, the way that little Jane... brings to mind this school ritual of having to go to prayers and going to have their coffee break and then a little bit of recreation, studying. So it's just laid out just sequentially for you. It also reminds me of my first days at school, of how I must have felt trying to get into this new routine, trying to get, I went to a Catholic school for my elementary years, and that was one schoolroom, and I had all my classes in the one room, and I had one teacher.
For every subject
except for music and PE.
Okay, these weren't nuns, were they?
No.
Okay.
Although we did have nuns. They were like the librarian, and then we saw them when we had to go to church like every week.
And this is K through 8, right?
Yes.
Kindergarten through 8th grade, you were in the same... Well, the same room, different year. Every year it's in a different room, right?
Yes, every year is different room. So we just, and I liked having the same teacher too. That was nice. But then I went to public high school, and that was, different classes. I had to sign up for classes and get my schedule, and that was very different. But I remember feeling that sense of apprehension, I had one friend that came to the same school from my elementary years, which was nice because then we also tried to get the same classes together. So I felt like I wasn't alone, when I went to elementary to high school. But that took a little bit to get used to that routine of figuring out what classes I want to take and then having to get to the class at a certain time and make sure I'm there on time. I feel like I kind of feel that description of Jane, what I did read Jane Eyre when I was in high school, so maybe there was a little bit of that. I feeling the same thing that Jane felt when she went to Lowood for me. But
did you like that? Was that too jarring going from the K through 8 school to the high school, which would have been you have different classrooms, you're picking your schedule probably. Mm-hmm. Like, how did your high school work? Did you have, I assume you probably had 5, 6 classes?
Yeah.
Did you have all 6 classes every day?
Yeah, I think you might have. There's some people who have different different blocks or
Yeah,
something
like I
on
wonder.
different days, but we had the same schedule every day.
In the same order and everything.
In the same order, yes.
Yeah, and that wasn't too jarring for you. You didn't. I mean,
I feel like I got used to it and I enjoyed that. It's a little different, and you get different teachers, you get different students, so it's interesting, and it's nice to walk around campus in the middle of the day, whereas before we were just all in the same class the whole time.
nuns looking over you with the rulers in their hands, right?
They were very nice.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we joked about this off air ever since we've met, but I'll tell the listeners here that Charlene went to 3 schools in her life. Charlene went to it.
That's you say it like that's very weird, but that's normal.
I mean, well, I guess it is to some degree where you lived in the same town all your life. My father was in the military, so we moved around a lot. Mm-hmm. But you went to one school from K through 8. You went to one school for all 4 years of high school, mm-hmm. and you went to one university for 4 years.
Yeah.
I went to 11.
Mm-hmm.
I went to 11 different schools in my life. I went to 5 different elementary schools, mm-hmm. And one of them was a K through 8 school, and I went there first, second grade, and then when I was in the 3rd grade, they changed my K through 8 school to a 4 through 8 school. Mm-hmm. So I had to go to a different school just for 3rd grade. Then I came back to my old school for 4th grade, and then I had to go to a junior high that was just 7th and 8th, and then I went to 2 different high schools. And you talk about how the schedule is different. I didn't think anything of it because it was just the only schedule that I'd ever known. But when I was in Hawaii in high school, we had 6 classes. We had all 6 on Monday, but then Tuesday, Thursday, we had 1, 3, 5, and Wednesday, Friday, we had 2, 4, 6. So on Monday, the classes were 45, 50 minutes long. And then the rest of the week, the classes were 90 minutes long.
Wow.
And but the days were a little bit shorter. Monday, we were in
Yeah.
school a little bit longer.
Huh.
And then when I got to Kentucky, I moved to Kentucky when I was in a junior year in high school. I had 6 classes, but we only had 5 per day. And so what they did was, on Monday, you had periods 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in that order. And then you didn't have the 6th period. So then Tuesday, you had 6, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then and on Wednesday, you had 5, 6, 1, 2, 3.
Right.
And then so that there was always one class. So you're always like, oh man, I don't have history today. Oh, it's so great. So it was something you can kind of look forward to.
But that's not confusing, I guess.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there were times where people showed up at the wrong class at the wrong time. I can picture it in my head, but it was always interesting because like when you had PE, sometimes it was nice to have PE in the morning or nice to have it in the afternoon as the last class of the day. And so you always look forward to, oh man, it's so nice to just have PE last. So I kind of got used to things being a little bit different.
Variety,
yeah, there was variety for sure. And I went to 3 different colleges, a junior college and 2 different universities. And so, I think you were talked about like this routine, which we appreciate the rigid routine. Mm-hmm. I got variety out of it, but it was still, that's just kind of how I am. Like, yeah. I can appreciate that. We joke about it, but you're the introvert, I'm the extrovert. I'd rather have something a little bit different and have to be forced to talk to people. And,
Well, speaking of you as an extrovert, then you must have had a easier time of it going into new school every few years. Because that seems very scary for me.
I think that's part of what it was. Because people have talked about it ever since I met you, and like your family always talks to me about, because your family is very much like you. They're kind of a quiet, soft-spoken, and they always talk about how like outgoing I am. And I'm like, well, yeah, maybe I was fortunate in that regard. That
you were forced to be.
Yeah,
somehow.
I was the new kid in school so often that you kind of have to, you learn to make friends. But the good thing is, I think what made it easier though a lot of times is I lived in military housing a lot. And so a lot of my classmates were going through the same thing I was. So it's easier to be extroverted when you know that a higher percentage of the people around you are extroverted as well, or at least
understand.
They understand. So they're more likely to talk to you because they're just like, oh, okay, I was the new kid once. I was, my dad just transferred in. And so it was like, But the funny thing was, before I forget, talking about the military, that's what the way you describe the routine at Lowood. That's what it reminds me a lot of. It reminds me a lot of military life in the military.
Your dad, or you?
No, just the like you're saying, like they awaken before dawn, and they do this, and then they do this, and that's something you see in the military. You have reveille at a certain time, then you got your mess hall, and you got so it's like it's almost like a military school. Lowood's kind of like a military
for young
school.
girls. Yeah, it's so strange. But just to go back real quick about how you would make friends. I feel like that's coming up with Jane in this chapter, where she's kind of forced to talk to Helen because she's all by herself and she doesn't know anyone and no one's talking to her. So she just kind of comes out of her shell a little bit. And
but where does that come from, though? That's interesting.
Yeah,
does that come from being pestered by the Reed children, and kind of getting a little thicker skin, and then saying, if I'm gonna get anywhere, I'm gonna probably have to talk to people. I can't just sit and read and stay home and not go for walks.
True. And it's good that Helen was reading, so that kind of drew Jane in, and of course that she created a friend from Helen, who, as I read this chapter, I didn't quite realize this until you mentioned it, but they never mention her name yet.
No, they don't mention Helen.
Yeah. So it's just this mysterious girl who's reading, older girl who's reading that Jane talks to. But
I had it in my notes that it seems like we're now 5 chapters in. It feels like there's only room to introduce one meaningful character per chapter.
They don't want to overload, I guess.
Yeah. That kind of that's the danger that you get in early stages of a book, right? Is you don't want to, because you got to remember, okay, which one's which? I totally forgot about Miss Scatcherd being the name of them, because you don't really hear her referred to very often. And so for a while there, you think Miss Miller is going to be, okay, this is the character for this chapter, but she's just sort of like a prison guard. That's the way I kind of see her. She's just there, just doing her job. Okay, we'll start this class. Okay, now we're going to round up the people. Okay, we're going to form these semicircles, and we're going to do that. And so to me, I thought the focus of this chapter, until we meet the unnamed little girl at the end, it's Miss Temple. This is Miss Temple's chapter. And I thought it was funny was even when Jane is having her conversation with Helen at the end, and she even asks her about Miss Temple, and Helen says she's very good and very clever. She's above the rest because she knows far more than they do. And so you're like, okay, another person, we got another ally, right? It seems like she's the one that's gonna not let them just eat the burnt porridge. I'll get them more. Out of my own, the bread and cheese. She's advocating
for these children. Yeah. And Jane also, she seems to be drawn to Miss Temple because she seems kind. Yeah. And we're drawn to her. Yes.
We're drawn. Like Miss Miller was just all business, but we don't really get a feel for her. But I think we're instantly drawn to Miss Temple. You see that caring aspect of her right off the bat. And so it's another one of those characters that I wish we could get more of. I'm hoping we get more of. I'm rereading it now. I kind of remember how much. I know she's plays an important role in Lowood, so I'm looking forward to being reminded of how enjoyable she was and how great she was with Jane.
Yes.
To your seats, Miss Miller. I have a word to address to the pupils. You had this morning a breakfast which you could not eat. You must be hungry. I have ordered that a lunch of bread and cheese shall be served to all. Monitors of the first class, fetch the globe. Form classes.
So another intriguing thing about this chapter, I think, is that it's really Jane describing what's happening around her. She's reacting, which I think is something you mentioned too, to everything, and she's not engaging as much. So as a reader, we are seeing what Lowood is like, and kind of put in her place of experiencing everything. And
she's like narrating more or less.
Yes.
Not a lot of dialogue in this chapter, I thought, right? It was just, It's just her describing everything. There's events happening around her. Characters are interacting amongst each other. And she's just sort of in the background. Like there's a great quote from the line where she says, "As yet I had spoken to no one, nor did anyone seem to take notice of me. I stood lonely enough, but to that feeling of isolation I was accustomed. It did not oppress me much." It don't impress me much. For she's driving the narrative for 4 chapters. All this stuff's happening to her, and all of a sudden in the 5th chapter, she's got a new location, and yet everything's just sort of happening around her. I picture like a person in a busy train station or an airport where you're just doing your thing.
It's very calming for her, maybe.
She's in her bubble.
No one is trying to get under her skin, or she doesn't have to fight anybody off. Like everyone's just going about their business, and she's just doing what she wants to do, or just observing people and taking things in. So that's little Jane for you.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it's so easy to just try to when you're writing a book, I guess you want to try to make everything's going to happen. She's got to be so proactive,
right.
and it's like sometimes you need a chapter where she just sits back, and then observes and lets things kind of happen to her. Like I said, she doesn't act; she reacts in this chapter.
And this is also the first time that Jane or Charlotte Bronte refers to the reader, which is something that continually happens and famously happens in the last chapter, where Jane says, "Let the reader add to complete the picture refined features, a complexion, if pale, clear, and a stately air and carriage, and he will have at least, as clearly as words can give it, a correct idea of the exterior of Miss Temple." So I had read an interpretation of why Jane refers to the reader so much, and it was to create a connection and to show how intimate she is with her storytelling by addressing the reader directly. That by her saying reader, she's giving you a heads up, I'm telling you the truth, and we believe her because she's speaking directly to us. And I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, very clever. That's I mean, who was doing that in the mid-19th century?
Oh, right? Gosh, I wonder. I would not know. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just something that good old Currer Bell came up with. And because that's one of the more fascinating aspects of this reread that I'm doing now is I want to see what did people in 1847 think when they read this? Oh. Like how groundbreaking was this? How different was this that made it so that became such a phenomenon?
I think that might be interesting, maybe for the last episode of this podcast series, where we could just dive into all the reviews of Jane Eyre at that time. Like,
oh God, see who totally missed the boat on it. And
there's a famous review by Elizabeth Rigby, I believe, where she just hated it, and it was just a long kind of diatribe against it. So it doesn't hold up as well today.
Well, yeah. What's funny was I have a friend who does online film reviews. And he's really into film criticism. And for Christmas one year, I bought him a book. I can't remember the exact title, but I think it was something along the lines of "The Critics Were Wrong."
Oh, yeah?
And it's a book full of very famous film critics just blasting movies that are considered absolute classics. And he liked it. He thought it was really cool. But at the same time, he's like, they're allowed to have their opinion. It's art,
Yeah.
And so it's like, I don't ever think that can an opinion be wrong? If that's just how you feel about something. Oh. You could say it's misguided, or maybe you need more information or something.
Yeah.
But
I think there's also a little bit of just the thinking at that time is a little, they're a little small minded. They weren't as something that Charlotte addressed in her preface to the book about morality, because I think that was a big sticking point at that time. Is this a moral book? And morality not being the same as conventionality? And I mean, we didn't really talk about the preface that Charlotte wrote for Jane Eyre, but
was that preface always there, or was it like in later editions?
Later editions. Oh, okay. So that's something that we could come back to, I guess, for looking at reviews at the later point.
Well, were people ready for this evolution in storytelling? Did they like their conventionality? Did they, this is what books are supposed to be like. This is what happens. This is what happens. And all of a sudden, this book comes out there. And even, I think, Wuthering Heights was before this?
Well, it was written before it, but it was not published before Jane Eyre.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, I think this one was more, hooked me more than Wuthering Heights did. But, I feel like maybe that's maybe what's what made it stand out, is that it was a little bit different, but not so shockingly different. Just very
not Wuthering Heights different.
Well, yeah, very well written, and that was like the one thing that I want to take out of this. And if there's anybody listening to this who is reading it for the first time, maybe you're reading along with us, Chapter 5 has some of the best writing so far I've seen from Charlotte Bronte. She's got a very good use of the language, the way she describes the setting. It's so easy to picture it in your mind. There's this particular scene where she describes the burnt porridge at Lowood. And I got this quote. I know we're dropping a lot of quotes in this episode, but I just love this quote so much because of the way she uses the language. And she says, quote, "I saw a universal manifestation of discontent when the fumes of the repast met the nostrils of those destined to swallow it." And I had to look that up. I'm like, repast? Oh. Repast is another word for meal.
Yes.
I did not know that. And then later when I think it's when they're done serving the burnt porridge, Charlotte writes, breakfast was over and none had breakfasted.
Oh, there's a little bit of snarky humor in there.
Yeah, and what's so funny is when I type it up on my notes, it like did it as a spell check. Breakfasted. Breakfast is not a word, but I'm like, Charlotte Bronte made it a word, and I'll give her credit to that. And then she even says, after she says breakfast was over and none had breakfasted, she said, thanks being returned for what we had not got.
Right.
It's really, really good. It's just she's showing off what a great writer she is, and I can really appreciate that. Chapter 5, so much stuff comes together, and I like where this is
enjoying it. Okay, that's great.
And where is it going? We get more foreshadowing, right? We know we love our foreshadowing.
So there's a moment when Jane sees Helen made to stand in the middle of the room by Miss Scatcherd, and little Jane thinks, how can she bear it so quietly, so firmly? Were I in her place, it seems to me I should wish the earth to open and swallow me up, which is foreshadowing a moment in the later chapter where Jane is going to have to experience that.
Spoiler. Yeah, I totally forgot about that when I was reading, having read it already, when I was reading that part, I'm like, oh, she's talking about how terrified she'd be if she's in that position. I'm like, oh, is she going to be in that position again, perhaps? But
poor Jane. Well, we'll see how she bears it later. So I think now we will head into our final recurring segment where we talk about a meaningful passage or quote. And let's have you, Mike, go first.
Well, like I said, chapter 5 has got a lot of really good quotes, and I kind of had to narrow it down. And I chose this one because it is meaningful. Like, we want it to be meaningful. And this is right around the time she meets Helen, the unnamed girl, unnamed classmate. And she says, I guess when she goes up and talks to her. And afterwards she says, I hardly know where I found the hardihood thus to open a conversation with a stranger. The step was contrary to my nature and habits, but I think her occupation touched a chord of sympathy somewhere. And she goes on to say, like, oh, she was reading a book and that's what I liked, but her book was a little bit thicker than the ones that I'm used to reading.
No pictures.
But it was still, no birds. But it was still that idea that, it reminded me about what we talked about earlier, introvert versus extrovert. And it's neat to see a 10-year-old girl, open to just going up to somebody in a crowded room, and someone who's by themselves. Maybe if it was a group of people, maybe it would have been a little bit different.
That's far more intimidating.
But that's one of the things that I like. And I think I told you the first time I read this book, Helen Burns is one of my favorite characters in the whole book. And right here, we don't get her name. We get just a really brief conversation with her. And even at the end, she's just like, I've already answered all your questions. I want to continue
I want to read. Yeah.
I want to keep reading. But I put in my notes, I said, through Helen, we see immediate growth in Jane. We see a 10-year-old girl, looking to her past, putting her past behind her and starting anew at this new school. She's like, I got a chance. The reads aren't here.
Right.
It's a little bit different. It's a little bit dark and gloomy, and I don't know what the food situation is going to be like, but I got some strict teachers. I got some caring teachers. I got this new friend that I got to make. And it seems like Helen's going to play a huge role, but I like that we don't learn her name. It kind of piques the reader's curiosity.
You don't know that she's going to be an important character.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume, it's because I noticed there's little clever touches throughout the second half of the chapter where Jane is talking about, I'm just observing, right? She's just reacting to everything that happens to her. And then she'll be like, oh, I heard a cough in the background.
Oh, I know.
And then she's just like, oh, then I was doing this. Oh, then I heard another cough, or I heard something. And then, to go up and basically say, this is contrary to my nature and habits. But yet she's growing at 10 years old.
Yes.
And I'm sure Helen has no concept of how important it is. It reminds me about the story you always hear about with celebrities, whether it be a celebrity or an athlete or a musician or whatever. If you meet them for 10 minutes, that's it. They go on. That 10 minutes means everything to you, but to them it's just like, I'm glad that they can take the time to talk to somebody for a few minutes. They could talk to 5 different people that same day and make 5 meaningful experiences for those 5 people. And for them, it's just, oh, whatever.
That's true.
I was on my way to dinner and then I did this and I talked to somebody, And so it's like, it's funny to think that what a great influence Helen has on her, and maybe she doesn't even realize it.
So my quote, which kind of goes backwards a little bit from what the meaningfulness of your quote, because my quote is from when Jane is leaving Gateshead. And she didn't want to say goodbye to Mrs. Reed, and Bessie kind of admonishes her for that. And Jane says, "It was quite right, Bessie. Your missus has not been my friend. She has been my foe." And I just think that's such a cute thing for little Jane to say, but she is holding a grudge, and it's a little jarring for a girl of 10 to have a foe, I think, that choice of words.
Bad for the blood. Or
Yeah,
bad
like
for the
we
blood.
said last time, yeah. And it's very earnest of her feelings. She doesn't, and she doesn't feel bad anymore like she was like she did in the last chapter, where she felt she shouldn't have said those things. Where now she's like, oh well, Mrs. Reed was always never kind to me, so I don't know why I should say goodbye to her, why I should say anything to her. So I think it's little Jane's justice that kind of appeals to me, where when she's older she can be more forgiving, and that's good. But I don't know, I like Jane to stick up for herself a little bit, and tell it how it is.
Well, it's like I said, it's a clean break, I think. And it's funny you mentioned that, because by the end of the chapter, she's trying something new, and you're seeing
like you
personality
said, she has
traits.
growth.
Yeah, she's got growth. We're seeing different personality traits. It's only been one day. And yet I wondered if it's just you realize that, like, okay, I'm in a new place now. I got to plan things out differently. I remember the first time when I went off to college, the first time I went off to university, and I got there, I remember thinking there were people in my dorm that I jokingly thought to myself, they never would have talked to me when I was in high school.
Oh.
Because they were a little too cool. The girls were a little too pretty. The guys were a little bit too handsome and athletic. And then you realize, I remember asking someone about it one time, and they're like, well, in college, it doesn't count. Nobody cares what you were in high school. This is college now. You got to be you got to be a better version of yourself. And I wonder if that's what it's like. She's left Gateshead,
yes.
and it's like she could be petty when she's leaving. And I would jokingly tell you that Miss Miller's bedfellow that I called you at the beginning of the episode, the other option I was going to call you was Mrs. Reed's best friend, because Mrs. Reed says, she said something about
I've always been your friend.
She said, you're going to tell people that I'm your best friend, or you're my best friend, and she's like, I'm not going to do that or whatever. And so, yeah, I like that. I like that, the idea that when you go to a new place, nobody cares where you're from before.
You leave all the preconceived notions behind, all your fear and anger.
Yeah, and maybe some of that pettiness is back there too, because I don't know. We'll see as we go along through her trips through Lowood. Does she snarky? Does she engage in that a little bit?
We get, again, Jane has to work through some of that a little bit more, and she will.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that, how it happens. Yeah, seeing that maturation continue, and then we'll get to meet more about Mrs. Temple. We'll get to learn more about Helen, and unfortunately we'll get the dark cloud of Brocklehurst hanging over her. We'll get to see more of him. Yeah.
I think that wraps up this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.